behalf of the University of New Orleans Department of Planning and Urban Studies and Robert Shreve, who supported us. He's the chairman and CEO of Gulf South Business Systems. I present Dr. Ralph Christy, who's a personal friend and a New Orleans native, who is currently the director of the Cornell International Institute for Food, Agriculture, and Development and professor of emerging markets at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He teaches and conducts food marketing research, educational programs on economic performance of markets and distribution systems. Professor Christy has advised industry leaders and public policy makers on food marketing strategies, economic development, and the organization of the global food economy. Dr. Christy is a Ph.D. graduate of Michigan State University's Department of Agriculture Economics. He's the past president of the American Agricultural Economics Association, currently a board member of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, WinRock International, and the Agribusiness Capital Fund. He's the author of 3 books: A Century of Service, Land Grant Colleges and Universities, 1890 and 1990, which came out in 1992, Achieving Sustainable Communities and Global Economy, that came out in 2004, and Emerging Markets at Forthcoming. His most recent research calls the attention for the role of creating an enabling environment for accelerating agro-industries' contributions to sustain economic growth and development. Please welcome Dr. Christy.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. That's a wonderful introduction. It is indeed my pleasure being here today. This idea of sustainability, as you well know, is really somewhat of a controversial term. It's also a mixed term. Depending on where you are, it has different meanings. I do recall one day having a conversation with a gentleman, and well into a half hour into this conversation, we discovered we had different concepts of sustainability. He was referring to financial sustainability. In other words, was there enough resources in the project that will continue beyond the life of the grant? I, of course, was concerned about environmental sustainability. What must this generation do to preserve the planet for future generations? Obviously, we were talking about very different things. Also, it is interesting that the topic that I'm going to focus on this evening, this idea of sustainable food systems, is one that intersects with both my professional and my personal life. My dad, after serving a stint in World War II, returned back to Ascension Parish, where he was an agricultural teacher, an extension agent, a leader in that rural and agricultural communities. And having raised 3 boys, he decided that one of these boys had to have gone on and study agriculture. Well, I was the last boy in the family, and I didn't see this coming. And it was well into my freshman year in the College of Agriculture, going to the universities, encountering friends who were studying law and physics and engineering and medicine. When asked what was my major, I sort of stumbled to this idea that I was majoring in agriculture. And then finally, one of my friends looked at me and said, "Oh, you're going to be a farmer." And I said, no, I'm not going to be a farmer. I don't think I'm going to be a farmer. But this idea of this being connected to agriculture was not a very fashionable thing. In fact, it took me a whole year to get a date. It was not very fashionable at all. But then the second year of college, I had an opportunity to go to Cameroon, West Africa, where I was part of a student exchange program. And for the students in the audience this evening, I'm going to be very, very prescriptive here. One of your semesters, go abroad. It's one of the most important things you can do in your life before you start your careers and your families. It's having that experience is invaluable. So it was through that experience my professional interest in this topic grew. I saw firsthand the importance of geodiplomacy. I understood the role of agriculture in economic development. I was very much a part of the conversation about what role that economics could play in furthering economic progress. And so thereby going on to graduate school, I saw the importance, and I'm happy that I saw that connection early in my life. Well, this is indeed a timely topic. It's timely for a number of reasons, because of some of the demographics that's occurring on the planet today, some of the challenges that are confronting this question of food makes this topic one that I think that we should pay very close attention to. At the end of my talk, I'm going to provide 4 very basic prescriptions or options. Some of these options might be a bit uncomfortable for some of you, or you might disagree. That's fine. That's the purpose of our conversation here today. But not only identifying the challenges or the problem that is confronted with feeding 9 billion people, I really think that there are some real options. So I'm not much of a doomsayer as the topic might suggest. But I would be remiss if I did not start this conversation with Mr. Thomas Malthus. Back in the 1830s, he advanced a very important theorem that suggested that the population was growing at geometric rates and that food production was growing at arithmetic rates. In other words, population was growing at 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, whereas our ability to grow food was growing at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And at some point in the future, we're all going to die from not having food. And he was pretty certain about this. And it was not necessarily good news. But we all know it's been 180 years since this theorem had been pronounced. We all know that we didn't die. We all know that the planet is still moving forward. And then there's plenty of evidence that would suggest that total food production, as you can see in this line, the upper line, has outpaced the population growth rate. And then in the last 30 years, that line has even gotten wider. So the per capita food production, we have enough food on the planet to feed a hungry world. I don't think that is a question here today. However, there are some concerns, and I'll get into those in a minute. Not only there's enough food production in the world, what is also interesting I want to call your attention to is that now not only the United States is a major food production in terms of export of food, but look at countries like Brazil and Argentina and Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia, India. These countries too, these so-called emerging market countries, are advancing their agricultural systems. Primarily through something called the Green Revolution that occurred perhaps in the 1970s with a very famous scientist, Norman Borlaug, bringing in the right science, the right inputs, the right fertilizers. That was a somewhat of a magical bullet that sort of improved the productivity of food globally. But this agriculture production, we will soon see, came at a cost. A tremendous cost. Most of the productivity or the amount of food production grew at the expense of expanding the land, a heavy use of fertilizers and chemicals. It undercut fresh waters and ecosystems that we are accustomed to. And then it was interesting to note that about half of all the nitrogen used in agriculture, this is nitrogen, and there's a lot of nitrogen plants along the river here in Louisiana. That stuff that makes the plant grows really green. About half of that nitrogen has been used just in the last 2 decades. So it's accelerating the nitrogen, accelerating the chemicals, expanding the land, and that's why we have really advanced ourselves in terms of maintaining that food production. Other costs. We're finding serious dead zones that are appearing in various places around the world. They are not exclusively the cause by agriculture, but many of them are. And so then the idea that agriculture at one time was the yeoman of the land, the person who protected the land, we're now beginning to see agriculture as the culprit. And this is something that is alarming, particularly when we start thinking about the future. To bring in this conversation closer home, if you look just outside the Gulf, here in Louisiana, one of the world's largest dead zones is right off our shores. And right past the Mississippi River, right through the Mississippi River, every day we find the nitrogen, the spill-offs, the fertilizer spill-offs. This is from agriculture from upstate, from upcountry in other states, from Minnesota all the way down through St. Louis, through Memphis. All the agriculture runoff is going in that river and going into the Gulf of Mexico, thereby causing somewhat of a dead zone. So there are real costs here that has really caused us pause now to look at this question about the production of food and whether or not we're producing enough food in the world today. 40% of our tropical and subtropical forest and 45% of our temperate zones are in question. We have 70% of our fresh groundwater is attributed to agriculture. We're finding pollution, and we're finding that climate change, about 14% of the greenhouse gases are coming from agriculture. So then, again, this agriculture has been growing and producing food, but is doing it at expense. Let me now turn to some of the demand sides of this issue, because all the conversations we've had thus far is focused on supply. But let's look at the demand. And then when you put these supply forces and demand forces together, I think you all will agree, too, that we are at a time in our history where we should start thinking quite seriously about the question of food. I don't want to be a neo-Malthusian here. I don't think Malthusian ideas are valid. I want to be an optimist, but I really have to get you to understand that this is becoming to be a very critical issue at our time. Well, when we look at the world hunger, the demand for food, there are about 850 million to 1 billion people on the planet who are still food insecure. That's an alarming number. It is also interesting to note that at the same time we have 1 billion people who are food insecure, for the first time in the history of the planet, we have 1 billion people who are overweight. And so we have this imbalance of people who don't get access to food and people who have an overabundance of food. And so then that raises questions about our distribution system, how food is being distributed. It's not that we're producing insufficient amounts, it's that we're not distributing it in ways in which people can get access to the food to prevent this question of food security. Sen, a very famous economist, discovered that in the midst of a famine, it had little to do with a lack of supply of food. What his famous pioneering article identified was the fact that people did not have access, they did not have incomes to buy the food. And so we have a world of plenty today, and we're discovering that that there are severe insecure food shortages that are consistent in many countries around the world. This is primarily true in the countries in red in Africa, both East and Southern in Africa. We go to different parts of South Asia, Mongolia. There are some problems along the Caribbean here. And so we find severe, almost acute food insecurities in these parts of the world. And I think it's a continuing problem. Another problem that we find with respect to the demand of food is this sort of proliferation of the so-called emerging markets of the world. Back in the 1970s and the 60s, when we were studying economic development, we lived in a two-tier world, a rich country or a poor country. But today we're finding the so-called emerging economies, the so-called BRICS. We find countries like Brazil and Argentina and South Africa and Russia and India. We're finding these countries advancing in their incomes. And as their income demand increases, we find a change in the demand for food. They're demanding more protein. They're demanding more food services. They're demanding not more necessarily more food, but they're demanding a percent of that income that goes to food is obviously declining. So what we're finding now, you take a country like China. China is having a huge growth. In recent years, we're talking almost double-digit growth for 10 to 20 years. Slowing up now at about 0.7%, 0.75%, and they are alarmed. I think the United States would be happy to get a 7.5% growth. 7.5% growth there is alarming. But that type of demand, you're finding 1.3 billion people, 300,000 people, 300 million people rapidly emerging to the middle income status, of having a tremendous demand on resources. Not only they have exploited the resources in their own countries, but now they begin to demand resources from all the other poor countries from around the world. And not only China is doing this, but as the so-called emerging countries emerge, they too would have a greater demand for food. And so this is something that we must continue to keep our eyes on. Let's look at population growth now. I found this chart to be really interesting. And what it suggests to us is that initially it took 1,200 years for the population on the earth to double. And if you notice that each time it doubles, it's taking a shorter and shorter period of time for the population on the planet to double. I think then the statistics are pretty clear now. By the year 2050, we're talking about 9 billion people on the planet. We have about 6 to 7 billion now, but by 2050, we're looking at 9 billion. That's going to require a 70% increase in the production of food. So then, when you put in totality the population increases, the income increases, the idea of the food distribution being a problem, when we begin to look at the supply questions of the nitrogen runoffs, the yield reduction of per acre slowing down, we begin to start looking at the water use. We begin to start looking at all the supply and demand forces. I think for the first time in my professional career, I think that we are in the midst of a perfect storm. And we all must become much more conscious about this type of challenge that is confronting the globe today. Both supply and well as demand is threatening our food security, is threatening our planet. And I think we need to act now and act most urgently. Again, the big question is, can we feed the 9 billion people? Can we do it sustainably? Can we be good stewards of the land such that future generations may be able to enjoy the planet as much as we have? Gordon Conway has written a very interesting book on this. Gordon Conway was recently the advisor to the British government, the first American to be president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Gordon has had a distinguished career, and I had an opportunity to have dinner with him a few months ago. And his new book out, Feeding the 1 Billion, is a really, really great read. But what Gordon is also pointing out here is this challenge of feeding 9 billion. Could you imagine if someone came to you and say, right now, not 9 billion, but let's say just 9 people was coming over for dinner? It would be a challenge. And so now we have on our planet the prospects of feeding 9 billion people, and trying to do it in a way to protect the environment is one of our major challenges. But there are options. And I want to focus on what might be the options. And I think it's going to require a change in our behavior. It's going to require a change in our policies, in our institutions. And then I want to drill down into 4 very specific concerns, and I think that's important. I think, first of all, we're going to have to not focus on expansion of land, particularly into forest and environmental ecosystems, but we need to start focusing on the restoring degraded land. This is going to be a really a mind shift. We're going to have to focus less on the incentives to produce, and we have to focus on incentives for the ecosystem, how to protect the environment yet increase productivity. We have to realize that we're not about predictable outputs, but more or less focusing on the questions of uncertainty, because climate change is radically going to affect our ability to produce food. Increasing supply for the sake of increasing supply has to be converted into a mindset about reducing the waste, not increasing supply. And then finally, this question of this yields and using high input chemical inputs will have to be reverted to the idea of developing a biodiversity and a more management of climate change. So these are sort of the formulas that we think that are important. These are the contours of the arguments. So let me then focus on 4 very specific ones. Some of them you might find acceptable. Some of them are quite controversial. But I take the position that we must keep all on the table, all options on the table at this point. The first one is this expansion of the agroforestry. Second is to preserve our natural ecosystem. Third is to reduce post-harvest loss. And then finally, I want to be very supportive of agricultural, particularly scientific innovations. And I'll speak to that the last one in greater depth, because I suspect that the fourth one will be the one that will be more controversial, because we will get into GMOs and biotechnology and those kinds of questions. The agroforestry. At one point, it was pretty clear that when we went to many countries around the world, we wanted people to farm the way we farm. So let's cut down the trees, let's plow up the land, and then let's have agriculture. That's the way we know it. And little did we understand that there are certain positive relationships, beneficial relationships between trees and plants. And so this is a whole new idea now that is resurfacing in a very, very strong way. Some of you may be familiar with Wangari Maathai, the woman from Kenya who won the Nobel Prize for the Green Belt movement. She started planting trees. It became a political movement. She strongly advocated the idea of going back to some of the more traditional ways of farming because she thought it was more sustainable. Well, it turned out that she's correct. Not only this idea of agroforestry in Africa is catching on, we find it in different parts of China, and we find that it is improving the soil, it's providing shade for certain plants. It is a relationship where you can have both of the best of both worlds. You can have the tree and the plant together, and then this is an idea that I think that certainly needs to be expanded. Second, certainly we must preserve our natural ecosystems. And if you stop and think of the alarming rate of certain parts of the world, particularly the Amazon in Brazil, if we would even bring this even closer and think about the ecosystems right here in Louisiana, how that has been exploited, we then really have to be conscious about providing laws, legislations to protect these so-called wetlands and environmental areas. Right now, because there's this question of food around the world that has grown to be a highly critical issues in certain parts of the world, what we are experiencing now is so-called land grabs. We're finding parts of Africa where China is going in and buying huge swaths of land, producing food, and shipping that food directly back to China. We're finding the same thing from Saudi Arabia and the Middle Eastern countries, where they are engaging in large expansion of agriculture production, oftentimes in fragile lands, oftentimes in governments that have soft infrastructure, where then the regulation and the regulatory environment to protect that land is not well in place. And so then there is a conscious movement that's going on now that if we're going to really do things in a more sustainable way, one of the options is to really preserve our natural resources. The third idea, reduce post-harvest loss. This is almost a no-brainer. But this idea of post-harvest loss has various dimensions to it. And I just remembered walking in a museum in France a couple years ago. Maybe many of you may be familiar with this very, very important and powerful painting called The Gleaners by Millet, where he's looking over peasants who are picking up grain off the ground, and how that particular work of art was not very popular at the time. But it was a powerful reminder to me about food waste. It turns out that 40% of the food, 30 to 40% of the food, between the time it's harvested and until the time it reaches the table, it's wasted. 40%, 30%, 40%. It varies between countries. And what this diagram here shows us is that in the so-called Europe and America, that waste is primarily happening at the consumption level. In other words, at the table. How much food that we order that we don't eat, how much food that is simply thrown away, how much food that is simply we don't finish eating, it stays in a refrigerator and it's spoiled. And more importantly, how much food that we see that it's lost because of the buy dates, by this particular date, and has no really effect on the quality of food. It's more or less a marketing gimmick to get you to purchase and buy food at a certain time. And food scientists are saying, well, the food can last longer than that. But we look at these buy dates, and they have very little underlying relationship to the quality of the food itself. I know before I found that out, I would go into my refrigerator, and if it was 2 days beyond that date, I wouldn't eat it. Perfectly good food. I was not aware. And so then we find that loss primarily being at the table in Europe and North America. What we find in many other developing countries, most of the loss is occurring at the farm level. And this loss is primarily because of poor infrastructure, in roads, refrigeration, the infrastructure that's needed to move food from one place to the other. We find in low-income countries and more developing countries, the loss is occurring primarily at the farm level. So this is something I think we all can be more mindful of in terms of making our planet more sustainable. Let me now then turn to the fourth and final recommendation or option that I would like to keep on the table. I think it's by far the most controversial one, and I would be delighted to have any questions or debates about this question. I live in a world of science. I'm around scientists every day, and so I don't feel the alarm when you say this is GMO, or I don't feel that alarm. And I know that there are strong arguments for and against. I'm going to try to outline those arguments, but I want to be clear, this is an option I'm going to keep on the table at this point. Here's the arguments and why I think it's critically important that we keep the GMO argument on the table. What we have here, GMOs, as you know, have been around really in the U.S. for about 17 to 18 years now. So whether you like it or not, any corn you eat, or corn chip, soda, anything that's derived from corn is the biggest crop that has been genetically modified. What I want to call your attention to is that the countries in green is where the GMO technology has been accepted around the world. Note that in Europe and in Africa, it's been less accepted. Europe sets in a state of food surplus, and Africa sets in a state of food deficit. And the controversy here is whether or not these countries will accept the GMO into their food system or not. Very controversial, a very controversial issue. The European says that they would prefer that these African countries do not accept GMOs. The U.S. government and many other countries around the world, through their foundations, through their governments, some people argue through organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that they tend to be pro-GMOs. And so the poor countries in Africa, many of them where we show you that acute food insecurity, are setting in the balance, trying to decide whether or not they're going to adopt this technology or not. Europe says any food that comes from Africa that goes to Europe that has GMOs, it's going to be effect on their trade. So then it's almost a conditionality. It's almost a threatening situation. It's almost a bargaining situation that we discover that the use of GMOs or not use of GMOs is being applied. But I think that an enlightened position to do, particularly when you start looking at graphs like this, you begin to understand that as we go to the future, any increases that we're going to get on an acre of land or yields is going to be taken primarily through the GMO advances as we go until now and into the future. In other words, through traditional agronomics and conventional breeding, we've pretty much flattened out what we can get from an acre of land. Just not going to produce anymore by putting more fertilizers or trying to use more water or other inputs, or through conventional breeding. It turns out that those advances now are likely to occur in the out years through using the biotechnology traits. What the biotechnology traits are doing is simply taking genes that are in the plants, putting markers on those genes, and moving them from one plant to the other. A lot of this happens in nature anyway. And so I think that science have done a very, very poor job in explaining what the technology is. These are things that happen in nature at any way. What happens here, science can help accelerate it. And I will give you some of the precautionary reasons here. I'm not totally propagating this particular technology. I think there are some downsides, and we need to be aware of them. But the positive sides are numerous. The gene for drought resistance. Very easy to put into plants. There's an older, wilder cousin, a grass, that was a corn at one point. That genetic material could be brought into modern day corn. And as we adopt to climate change, to the planet becoming more warmer, to areas becoming more prone to drought, having those seeds is a tremendous breakthrough to food security and feeding people around the world. This is one important advance that the biotechnology will allow us. Secondly, certain viruses. We are producing almost homogeneous crops now. They are quite susceptible to viruses to wipe out a complete crop in a week or two. Unless we have the type of resistance to certain viruses, we find that crops could be devastated, as is the case of the papaya in Hawaii. By show of hands, how many of you have recently consumed a banana? Just raise your hand. Almost most people in the room. Banana is subjected to the same type of attacks over time, and there's very, very serious blight now that's attacking bananas around the world. I don't think that there is a conventional breeding technology that would prevent that, but whether you realize it or not, bananas could be in a very different state in a few years from now. Maybe very difficult to get unless the technology is developed to solve it. The same thing with wheat. There's a wheat rust that's moving across the Middle East into northern parts of Africa that is affecting any plant that looks like a wheat. It could be sorghum or any grain crop like that. There's no conventional ways of fighting off these viruses. And so then we have to keep this technology on the table. Finally, if we're going to increase this idea of meeting the billions of people, now 7 billion, we're talking about 9 billion by 2050, we need to have a technology that's going to increase food productivity. So then, in other words, I think that we really are in a parallel situation here. I think we have the ability to prove Malthus wrong, and we must feed the 9 million people, but we also must do that in a way in which it is sustainable in protecting the future of our natural resources. I'm going to close with the question, why? Why must we do this? Why should we care? Why should we think of these issues in global terms today? And I want to submit to you, there are 3 or 4 very powerful reasons why I think that we should do this. For those of us in advanced countries who don't think much about where our food comes from, at one point, our grandparents, it was a matter of functional. You know, if they didn't go out in the backyard and harvest their food and work for their food, they didn't eat. For us today, it's entertainment. Let's do lunch. Let's have dinner. And we don't think the importance of food in a global context because we are so immune to the idea of the lack of need that the questions of food insecurity are really, really pressing issues around the world, that oftentimes we think food is a form of entertainment. I get really concerned when I go to various restaurants and they have these eating contests. How many hot dogs you can eat in 7 minutes, or how large of a steak you can eat. And people are just gorging out on food as if it's some type of competitive game. It really makes me wonder whether or not they are engaged on the same planet in which I live. So then we must ask the question why, and understand that we are part of a global world. First reason why. It is in our economic interest to do so. It's now becoming an economic imperative. Because as we look around the world today, we see the so-called poor countries, the developing countries, inextricably connected to us economically. That was not the case 30 years ago. It all started that morning when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher sat in the White House with Helmut Kohl from Germany and decided to pursue something called the Washington Consensus, that they would put the world economic order together in such a way where markets would become the predominant source of organizing economic activity on the planet. I say to you this evening, there are only 2 countries on the planet that does not subscribe to a market. Most of Asia, most all of Africa, certainly Western Europe and Australia and the United States, there are only 2 countries. Cuba and North Korea. The rest of the world have gone to markets. And if you don't really comprehend that, just look at where your shirt is made, or where your trousers you're wearing, or the sweater you're wearing. All of our clothes and much of our economic activity is linked to one another. And so we must care. A second reason I think we should care is because of political stability. As countries become poor, I think one of the root causes of strife and civil war is people who are marginalized and people who don't have resources and people who are willing to fight to get something that they don't have. And so having some sense of economic development, I think goes a long way in bringing about the type of stability that I think is important on the planet today. I think environmental reasons is yet a third reason why we should consider to think of the global commons, because we are indeed connected to one another. Fourth, I think health. Stop and think of the number of people who get on and off an airplane and just how rapidly they could bring a virus or a bacteria that could be harming to human health or even to our agricultural systems in a matter of weeks. 2 years ago, we had the H1N1 virus. I think there are a number of other possibilities that's lurking around the world today, and we have to begin to start thinking quite globally around these issues. Fifth, I would argue that there's still a real need for humanitarian interest here. We don't do it because of this in our economic interests or political interests, all the other issues, but I think a country that has humanitarian goals is a strong country. A country that considers the least of those on the planet is a strong country. And I would wish that our foreign policy now would get more back to questions of humanitarian goals, not just issues of what's in our best interest, but what is the right thing to do. It seems to me that's an important consideration. Sixth and final reason why I think you should care is because I think it's our national defense. I really do. I think that we can no longer think of the United States only in terms of military power or only think of diplomacy. We now must add that other D, development, to the toolkit and put defense and diplomacy and development combined as some sort of soft power as we advance the United States' interests around the world. Dealing with issues of food insecurity, dealing with issues of poverty, dealing with issues of sustainability, as a part of our national foreign policy, I think is becoming critically important. Back to the humanitarian issues and the questions of poverty, one of the main faces that we have on the poverty question around the world is women. Women. I really think that the question of advancing women's rights around the planet is an important issue. It's both our national security, it's both an humanitarian issue, it's one that we should pay our highest attention to. I think the women question is as important as the question of slavery, as it was over 150 years or so ago. The type of economic bondage that women find themselves in, and you would have to go to some of these places and observe the trafficking and those sorts of issues, it should be first and foremost a part of our foreign policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for inviting me here this evening to share with you my thoughts on the question of sustainability, on food security, and on poverty. I think there's a lot here for we all to be a part of and all to take extremely seriously as we move toward 9 billion people for dinner. Thank you very much.